Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our Cost and Effectiveness of Living Shorelines webinar hosted by the Nature Conservancy, Stevens Institute of Technology, and the Jacques Cousteau Reserve. We are so happy to have so many of you with us today from far and wide. We have a lot of people on, so we're going to ask that everybody stay muted and keep cameras off except for our presenters today, just to save bandwidth. This meeting is going to be recorded just for your awareness. And we have had some requests to share afterwards, so we'll be sharing the recording link with all of the registrants after the webinar. As far as our agenda today, we're going to start off with our presentation from Stevens about their cost and effectiveness report, and then we'll move into a small panel discussion with some of the folks who actually worked on these living shoreline projects. By way of introduction, we would love if you want to put your affiliation and where you're from in the chat box. I know we have a lot of folks from New Jersey and New York, and even some from across the country. So that's great to see, and you can go ahead and add that in the chat. And I think with that, we are ready to introduce Bill Shadell, who is with the Nature Conservancy, and he's going to give us a little background on this project and the background of the report. So Bill, you can take it away.
Thanks, Vanessa. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of TNC New Jersey, welcome to the webinar. We're very happy you're here. So I just want to give you a little background and then lead us into introducing our speaker. Over the past 10 years or more in New Jersey, living shorelines have really come a long way. From the early struggles to implement a simple arrangement of biologs, New Jersey now has a general permit, engineering guidelines, a number of on-the-ground projects, some of which are pushing the envelope a bit on ingenuity. In the past, projects were sponsored by, quote unquote, the usual suspects, like conservation NGOs, natural resource agencies, and that was pretty much it. Now we're seeing demonstrated interest from a growing number of municipalities, engineering firms, and private landowners. One of the goals of TNC New Jersey is to help living shorelines become a business as usual practice. We aim to fill an information gap to demystify living shorelines. And one of the ways we did this was by working with our partners to convene workshops and webinars like this one. Previous topics included design, monitoring, permitting, and lessons learned from on-the-ground projects. Two big questions that regularly came up: are living shorelines effective, and how do they compare in cost to conventional gray solutions? These are complex questions, so we asked the engineers at Stevens Institute of Technology to help us explore them using real on-the-ground projects in New Jersey. Previously, Stevens had performed a similar cost analysis for living shorelines on the Hudson River, and then adapted those methods for the study. The projects selected for the study were not replicates, but instead were selected to provide a range of techniques for a range of site conditions. I'm happy to say the final report will be released in early 2021. So now I'm just excited to have Dr. John Miller here today to share the results of the study. I'll hand it over to John.
Great, thanks, Bill. So before John gets started, I'm going to let him take over the screen share. And I do want to say, if you have questions at any time throughout John Miller's presentation or throughout the entire program, just go ahead and put it in the chat. I'll be monitoring it, and I will make sure your question gets to the appropriate speaker. And with that, we'll turn it over to John. John, you are on mute still. I don't know if you're talking yet.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yep, we can.
Sorry about that. It was saying that the host needed to unmute, so I was trying to coordinate that.
Sorry about that.
No worries, no worries. Are you viewing the appropriate screen now? All right, good.
Yep.
Technological details all taken care of. All right, so well, thanks everybody for joining today, and it's a pleasure to come to talk about this project. I mean, this was a unique opportunity that when it was first pitched to us, it was a very daunting task. The idea of comparing cost and effectiveness of living shorelines projects across a range of different conditions, spanning low energy to high energy, looking at different projects constructed for different purposes. So constraining the cost and the effectiveness very quickly became something that we purposefully entitled the project Costs and Effectiveness, not necessarily Cost Effectiveness, because we realized that there was not a simple single ratio that we could develop that would sort of encompass the range of different conditions and different projects that we were asked to look at. So with that, just to give you an outline of the talk that I'm going to be presenting. First, we'll talk a little bit about each of the sites that we looked at. We did look at 5 different sites. As Bill mentioned, they're not replicates. They are actually quite unique sites. And then we'll dig into the cost analysis a bit. We basically looked at 2 different types of costs. We looked at sort of a project cost analysis, which was information that was obtained from the project sponsors and designers in terms of the actual cost to construct the project and monitor and maintain, in some cases, the projects. And then we looked at each project through a long-term cost analysis lens, and this is sort of taking a 60-year look at what the expected cost might be for the different projects using a technique that we had employed in New York State for the Hudson River Sustainable Shorelines project. And then we looked at the effectiveness of the projects from, again, 2 different points of view. One was through the lens of shoreline stability, and the other was through wave attenuation. So up front, just one thing to say is that we are looking at the projects mostly from an engineering perspective, and that there are other groups, particularly Rutgers is involved, TNC is involved, Partnership for Delaware Estuary, looking at effectiveness from more of an ecological standpoint. But that's not included in today's discussion. And then finish up with some conclusions, and then hopefully leave plenty of time for discussion, as I think the discussion panel is actually the most interesting part that we'll do today. All right, so beginning with a overview of the sites and the projects at those sites. First location that we looked at was Berkeley Island. Berkeley Island is a county park in Ocean County, New Jersey. It's on Barnegat Bay. You see the pictures on the right-hand side. The park at one time was an island. It's now connected to the mainland. We got involved with this project actually as we were writing our Living Shorelines design guidelines. This was sort of the first project to put those guidelines to the test. And we worked with the project engineers, New Jersey DEP, to develop a project to stabilize essentially the south shoreline of the project. So this is Berkeley Island over here. This is the parking lot that was being threatened by erosion. So we worked with the state and T&M to develop designs for these low-crested sills. Initially, we were working with the idea of sort of a traditional rock segmented sill structure. Working with the project engineers, the soils there were extremely unstable. So they came up with this unique design of sort of a wooden bulkheaded spine, I call it, that runs through the actual sill, dips down in the areas where the windows or the gaps are, to ensure that the crest elevation would remain constant over time. The worry was that the rocks would actually begin to sink, and the sill structure itself would become unstable. So this is sort of a unique design that was developed for this specific project and has since been used at a couple of other sites as well. Tide range here very small, 6 inches, and exposure wave fetches up to between 2 to 5 miles. So fairly decent exposure to the south side at this site. Gardner's Basin, this site is down by Atlantic City. as you can kind of see by the pictures on the right-hand side, Gardner's Basin is inside this basically commercial boating basin here. So it's a very enclosed site, very limited fetch exposures, tide range on the order of 4 feet or so. This particular site is mostly boat wakes from these big ships that come in and out, but they're also moving fairly slowly, so not a whole lot of energy in here. This site in particular ended up being a low-crested stone sill with an elevation of right about 1 foot. Actually, no, the elevation of this sill is right about at mean high water. So there's a rock sill here with an area of intertidal marsh plantings behind it. And then on the backside, there's a planted or vegetated berm to provide surge protection or flooding protection for the parking lot behind it. The next site was Strathmere. Strathmere was a small eroding shoreline at the end of Bay Avenue. So there's a little boat ramp at the end of Bay Avenue. The boat ramp was in the process of being replaced, or the bulkheading around the boat ramp was in the process of being replaced. The boat ramp basically juts up against this open sort of marsh area. There's a couple of drainage ditches here that are also contributing to the erosion, but basically the marsh edge here on the end of the boat ramp and roadway have been disappearing over time. The fetch here very limited, about a half a mile. Most of the erosion here likely due to boat wake activity or combination of that as well as the drainage ditches during storm events, some flows coming out of those drainage ditches contributing to the erosion. The design here ended up being a sort of a terraced structure where we have a stone toe at the base of the sort of terrace or flat section. Some intertidal plantings here behind the stone toe. A second row of protection with some planting behind it. The second row of protection was core roll or coconut fiber logs here. This particular project, actually, the coconut fiber rolls didn't fare all that well. We had a fairly rough winter the year after the project was constructed, and we believe it was the ice that removed some of the coconut fiber rolls, but the stone toe has been pretty successful and has been stable in kind of keeping that lower toe or lower edge in place. Gandy's Beach, kind of moving around here. So Gandy's Beach is probably the largest site in the study. This is a site that was constructed by the Nature Conservancy, monitored by Partnership for Delaware Estuary and Rutgers. Sovereign Consulting has also been involved at this site. It's an extremely wide open site. The edge of the marsh here is fairly unstable. Fetches of up to 10 miles, so out into Delaware Bay. So extremely exposed. Having been there many times, I would say that it's the wave energy is extremely variable, comes from multiple different directions during different times of the year. Tide range at this site is on the order of 6 feet. So you have the combination of high energy, high tides, making this a very tricky site to work with. The design here actually called for a series of oyster castles. So there are several oyster castle reefs. You see just an example of one of them here. Generally constructed, as you see here on the right, in a series, anywhere from I think 4 to 5 structures in a row, segmented gaps in between. This particular project focused on one set of structures, which kind of faces out here, mostly to the out to the west. Although at the site, there's actually, I believe, 5 or 6 different sections of oyster castles built to stabilize varying edges of the marsh. And finally, Matt's Landing. Matt's Landing is the oldest project in the study. It's also probably one of the lower energy sites. It's here on on the riverbank here. I believe it's the Morris River. I'm not positive. And the technique here consists of a combination. This is the Partnership for Delaware Estuaries site. So Josh Moody will be on later. He can talk more about this. But the technique consisted of core rolls in combination with some shell bag, I believe, stabilization. Really interesting project. One of the first living shorelines projects in the state. You can see this image here in particular is great because it shows the capturing of sediments behind the core rolls. So that's one of the successful aspects of this project. So as you can see, by looking kind of just a very quick run through these different sites, we have tide ranges from 6 inches to 6 feet. We have fetches ranging from max landing, the fetch might be a tenth of a mile, all the way up to 10 miles, right? So we're talking orders of magnitude difference in tide range and exposure. Some sites lots of boat traffic, others not so much. Some sites more subjected to icing than others. So really a sort of a diverse group of projects that were selected for this, this study. And so one of the things that we wanted to do is, before I get into the cost analysis, one of the things that we wanted to do is we actually compared some of the living shorelines projects with traditional gray infrastructure, mostly on the cost side, just to get a sense of relative differences between the two. So moving into the cost analysis, I saw Laura smiling, like my little GIF here. So we're going to talk about costs. Okay, so what do? We did kind of two different things, project cost analysis and long-term cost analysis. To kind of break them down, project cost analysis, we sent out inquiries to project designers, DEP, others involved in these projects, trying to collect as much cost information as possible. As you might expect, we got differing levels of cooperation. So we do have, first caveat is that we do have different levels of detail in terms of some of the cost estimates that we have. So what we tried to do is we tried to piece together what we had in sort of the most coherent way as possible. And what we ended up doing is sort of categorizing the costs, as you see in number 3 here. We kind of categorize the site, the costs into different groups, basically mobilization, materials, labor, design and permitting, maintenance, adaptive management, and monitoring. Again, some of the projects we were able to get information for all of these categories, and in some just parts of these categories. So we wanted to kind of get as much as we could and then just kind of put the information out there so that people could react to it. On the long-term side, again, the process that we used was similar to what we had done before for the Hudson River Sustainable Shorelines projects. Basically, we tried to take a 60-year lifespan, sort of a life cycle cost analysis, where we considered things like repair of projects after major storms, what are the typical maintenance requirements for different types of projects, and again, tried to vet this with as much information as possible. So, we had an approach that we had laid out for the Hudson River project. We adapted that to kind of consider local cost considerations in New Jersey, modified the methodology to consider things like sea level rise more locally in New Jersey, and came up with an approach or a framework I think that is useful. But it does need to be said that this is all the level of information that feeds into this again varies because the projects themselves, the level of information we're given kind of varies. But the idea is that we categorize costs into different groups for long-term costs: initial costs, maintenance and repair costs, damage costs, replacement costs, and monitoring and adaptive management costs. And we kind of see how those different factors kind of play out over time in sort of the framework that we've developed. So just kind of to go through quickly the project cost analysis summary. Again, because of the variability in the amount of information we're able to get, I think the most important kind of takeaway from this is not necessarily project specific costs, because people may look at these and say, some of the project designers may be on this call and may say that's completely wrong. But this reflects kind of what we were given again. So really, the sort of the range in costs is kind of something that I think is the most relevant kind of takeaway from the analysis. So we developed a number of tables, kind of like you see here, where our cost categories are here on the left-hand side. So mobilization, materials, labor, you can kind of see them, read down there. And then we have each of our projects kind of listed across the top. You can see the lengths of the projects were significantly different. And we kind of put the costs where they fell, and then kind of summed everything up down here at the bottom. And the yellow bubble is to kind of highlight the final sort of total cost per linear foot, which includes monitoring costs in cases where we did have that information. So what you can see is that the cost for the Living Shorelines projects range anywhere from $88 per linear foot all the way up to $2,018 per linear foot, generally corresponding to the least complex site being, of course, the cheapest, and the more complex, higher energy sites ended up being on the more higher end of the cost range. Like I said, we did solicit or I try to identify local. So each of these sites, we looked nearby to see if there were examples of traditional gray infrastructure built in similar settings, not exactly the same settings, just to get a sense of how the costs may compare for that traditional infrastructure versus the living shorelines. So we were able to identify a couple of different bulkhead projects near Gandy's Beach, a bulkhead near Strathmere, and a bulkhead near Gardner's Basin. Again, different lengths of projects, and again, we've got that as much information as we could, put it into our little chart here, did the same sort of tabulation. And again, if you focus on this yellow bubble, that gets you the total cost per linear foot, including monitoring. And you see that the traditional gray infrastructure ranged from $462 per linear foot up to a whopping $2,558 per linear foot for a very complex bulkhead project in Gardner's Basin. So again, a wide range of costs for the traditional gray infrastructure. I guess one of the takeaways from this analysis is that if you looked at the green infrastructure or the living shorelines, design and permitting, maintenance and adaptive management, and monitoring costs were typically much higher for the living shorelines projects than they were for the traditional gray infrastructure projects. And that's, I guess, kind of to be expected. One of the big takeaways is obviously the monitoring costs. Generally the gray infrastructure, there's not much in terms of monitoring requirements, or not even requirements, but there's no expectation, there's no need to really monitor. So that's a big thing that kind of separates out some of the living shorelines costs. So you can see, for example, Gandy's Beach, the monitoring costs were extremely high. That was sort of an experimental project, trying out a bunch of different techniques. It was a project sponsored by, I believe, it was NIFLIF. Well, I'm sure Adriana will tell us later. So there were requirements there, and that didn't exist for some of the other projects. So it artificially drives some of the costs up for the living shorelines projects. So it's important to keep that in mind when kind of comparing between living shorelines project costs and traditional infrastructure costs. Okay, so this is a lot. So this is just kind of the total, big picture comparison. Really, the last bullet's the only thing that's changed here. So size and complexity are linked to cost is really the takeaway here. So the yellow boxes identify the least expensive project in each of the categories, living shorelines being at the top and traditional gray infrastructure being at the bottom. Again, the cheapest or the smallest, least complex sites tended to be the cheapest, which is no surprise. And the larger, more complex, higher energy sites were the most expensive. And those are the purple boxes, just for comparison's sake. Okay, so long-term cost analysis, and this is actually a presentation in and of itself, right? So this is just a very high-level overview of this. There's a report on this that's on the Hudson River Sustainable Shorelines Project website. I saw Emily online, so maybe she can put it into the chat, the website. But the overall idea is that you kind of look at a 60-year cost estimate, and you break your costs up into different categories. The initial construction cost, and then damage costs due to a variety of different storms, return periods ranging from 10 to 50 years. Damage costs for ice, which is something new that we added to this particular project. Replacement costs, so for structures like a bulkhead, the assumption is that a bulkhead has a design life. Maybe it lasts 30 years, maybe it lasts 50 years, but at some point the bulkhead is going to need to be completely replaced. So you're talking sort of whole scale, basically a reoccurrence of the construction cost, another occurrence of that initial cost at some point in the lifespan of the structure. whereas the living shorelines projects don't have that sort of full-on replacement cost. Maintenance cost is sort of typical upkeep of a project. And again, new for the New Jersey analysis is we split out monitoring and adaptive management costs. So the kind of idea, and we went back and forth about what the difference between maintenance costs and monitoring and adaptive management were. Monitoring and adaptive management are sort of so if you had like a curve of costs over time, the idea would be that, at the very beginning, you might have some initial increase as you're trying to tweak the project and get it just right. But at some point, the cost would sort of level off. So the cost after it levels off is sort of your maintenance cost. And that sort of initial sort of tweaking to get the project just right is sort of your adaptive management cost. So we broke down all these different costs. All the costs are kind of related back to a percentage of the initial cost. And then really the interesting thing here is the last column over here, the total column, where we basically look at what is the, for each of these cost categories, what percentage of the total final 60-year cost corresponds to the initial cost, the damage costs, in each of these categories. And basically that's where we start to get into sort of a comparison between sort of the traditional projects and the living shorelines projects, where basically what we see is that for the living shorelines projects, we see a more even distribution of the costs over time, as the damage costs, the maintenance costs, and the monitoring and adaptive management costs are incurred more consistently over the course of a project, but they're not the same level or magnitude as sort of like the initial construction cost. For the traditional shoreline stabilization, these again mostly bulkheads in the projects that we were in the group that we had. Really, you have sort of two big hits, right? You have the initial construction cost, big money out of your pocket in the beginning, and then there's a period of time where there's very little that kind of happens. Maybe there's some repair after a big storm occurs, but then you don't really have another big hit, and so you have to replace the project completely at some point. And typically right around year 40 to 50 is our assumption. So what we see is this sort of distribution of costs being different for living shorelines projects versus traditional projects. Okay, so moving on to effectiveness. And again, just a very sort of high level kind of run through what we found in terms of effectiveness. We looked at two things, shoreline stability and wave attenuation. For shoreline stability, we tried to do a bocce type design where we looked at a control. We looked at a control site as well as the project site, and we were looking at basically shoreline position. What we defined as shoreline varied from site to site. In some cases, it was a true like a sandy shoreline. In other locations, it was a vegetation line, depending on whether it was more of a marsh or more of a beach type system. What we did is we looked at sort of the pre-project changes, so what was happening before the project was built, and then kind of the impact of the project. We ran into some issues with Google Earth in terms of sort of historical aerial imagery not being clear. So that's what we mean by where possible. In some cases, the older imagery was just not good enough to be able to do a real accurate sort of pre-design, pre-project comparison. While we were out, we actually were using RTK GPS and some drone photographs, aerial imagery. So for our specific monitoring, we had good data, but some of the historic information was less good. And then for wave attenuation, we put out a variety of instruments in front of and behind the structures. I believe for this project, we were using wave logger 3s, so wave staffs in front of and behind the structures. Deployments ranging from several days to several weeks. It depended. Some projects were more, again, subjected to wind and storm conditions, and others were more boat weight driven. So depending on which of the two was the controlling factor, depended on how long we put the instruments out for. So just a summary of the shoreline stability analysis. Basically, 3 of our 5 projects were clearly effective in stabilizing the shoreline. The other 2 projects were unclear because of the quality of the imagery. 2 of the sites actually experienced what I call some significant shoreline advancement. The table up on the right-hand side kind of illustrates really the sort of takeaway is the annual rates of shoreline change, looking at the before and after rates of shoreline change, but then also looking at the control sites. So even in some cases, We have, even in cases where we don't necessarily have accretion happening, we do have a slowing of the erosional rate. So overall, 3 of the 5 living shorelines projects were effective in stabilizing the shoreline. Looking at the wave attenuation, we had 3 projects that had a sill as a part of the project. So we looked at all 3 of those projects. And what we found is that when the waves were larger than 5 centimeters, and this is, so what's 5 centimeters? So the instruments have a certain, I guess, believability threshold. There's a certain amount of noise and certain natural fluctuations, which are not necessarily waves in the system. So 5 centimeters is roughly kind of what we would consider probably believable or significant at the very least. So what we found is that when the waves were larger than 5 centimeters, pretty much all 3 of the sills were effectively dissipating the wave energy. They were reducing the waves anywhere between 20 to 80%. I would say roughly 40 to like 75% was sort of the most common or the most typical wave attenuation that we were measuring at the sites. You see the 3 sites summarized at the bottom. One of the things that was somewhat interesting is Gandy's Beach is, and this is kind of I guess a teaser for another study that we did. So Gandy's Beach, we've done 2 studies, one specifically looking at 1 set of oyster castles, and then the other looking at sort of the larger project site as a whole. So different, all 5 sets, or all 4 sets of oyster castles. And I wanted to kind of throw this out there as sort of a teaser and a sort of something to think about. So what we were finding at Gandy's Beach is that we were seeing what we expected, particularly when the structures were, when the water levels were lower. We were seeing significant wave attenuation across the structures, as we might expect. Once the water levels got high, we were seeing sort of significant scatter in our data, including in some cases we would actually see the waves behind the structures larger than they were in front of the structures. Now, fortunately for that study, we actually have an ADCP out, and we have directional wave information, and so there's a lot that goes into this. So we think some of this is seasonality. We think some of this might be waves getting trapped behind the oyster castle structures. So there's a interesting sort of science question there that we're continuing to pursue as part of this other project. But the reason I point this out is that it's important that we kind of understand this. Particularly if it's related to waves potentially getting trapped behind the structures, because that might have an influence in terms of the stability of the edge, of the marsh edge, behind the structures. So this was really quick, but I know I want to leave time for our discussion. So just some conclusions. This is supposed to illustrate jumping to conclusions in case anybody's wondering what the cartoon is. So the overall conclusions of our cost and effectiveness analysis, traditional shoreline stabilization costs were higher than the Living Shorelines project costs for the 5 sites and the 5 comparison sites that we were able to obtain information for. Again, caveat there being that our results are only as good as the information that we were able to get from the project designers. The cost for both traditional living shorelines projects increased with complexity. That's kind of, again, sort of a no-brainer, but sometimes it's good to just kind of have the numbers kind of reinforce what you would anticipate. The design and permitting, maintenance and adaptive management and monitoring costs are all higher for living shorelines projects than they were for the traditional projects. Again, this is something that might be expected, and this is something that I think as we try to encourage more and more living shorelines projects. I think everybody in this call has kind of talked about this at some point. There's a sort of a difference in the mentality between a living shorelines project versus a traditional project. Traditional project looks the best the moment it's done and it deteriorates over time. Living shorelines projects may look the worst the day it's completed and evolve over time and become better and better with time. These types of factors are things that kind of play out in some of the results that we have here from our cost effectiveness analysis. Living shorelines projects costs are more evenly distributed over time, and this number 4 directly relates to number 3, right? As you might expect, because of the maintenance and adaptive management and monitoring requirements for living shorelines projects, we see that the costs are more distributed over time. Whereas with the traditional infrastructure projects, it's kind of, sink a whole lot of money into it, walk away from it, forget it for some period of time, and then come back, 30 years later, 40 years later, and kind of redo the entire project. But big costs, sort of at more spread out moments of time versus smaller costs, kind of budgeted through over that same sort of lifespan. Each of the living shorelines projects was successfully able to stabilize the project shoreline. So the nice thing about this is, again, the range of projects we have. So we have everything from a core roll project constructed in an appropriate environment for that project that Josh will talk about later, that worked very well. And we had much more sort of higher energy type projects, the wooden bulkhead spine with the rock sill, that was also effective at stabilizing that shoreline. So everything from sort of a higher energy to sort of much lower energy, appropriate techniques being used in appropriate settings resulted in positive outcomes. And lastly, all of the sill projects were successfully attenuating waves greater than 5 centimeters. So again, I didn't mention it, I don't know if I mentioned it previously, but the crest heights of all these structures were roughly mean high water, within 1 foot of mean high water, maybe 1.5 feet of mean high water, which not necessarily a surprise, but when constructed in such a manner, the structures are attenuating waves. That little caveat there, that asterisk, is, again, for really complex sites, there can be some unexpected results that probably should be investigated, because they may ultimately have some impacts in terms of shoreline stabilization of those projects. And with that, I think, end my presentation, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time for discussion amongst the panelists.
Great, thank you, John. We do have a lot of questions coming through in the chat. I think some of them are more appropriate to be answered now because they're specific to the methods in the report, and then some of them will be better answered during the panel. So for the people who ask questions, if I don't get to your question now, it's because I'm saving it for later. So John, there were some questions about the adaptive management and monitoring costs. What's going into them? How are they defined? Do they include sea level rise? Can you speak to that a little bit?
So the costs are, the adaptive management and monitoring costs come directly from the project sponsors. So for example, one of the highest monitoring costs that you might have seen in that presentation was related to the Gandy's Beach project. And we just, in working with TNC, who sponsored our work, obviously we had access to unbelievable amounts of information. So Adriana was able to provide, all of the information, including the budgets for the monitoring. So we had that sort of directly. We also had some estimates from Partnership for Delaware Estuary and their monitoring work at some of the projects. So those are real sort of hard-coded numbers. Again, the downside is that we didn't necessarily have that for every project, particularly the gray infrastructure projects. But then again, that's typically not really required. And in adaptive management, really what we did is we worked with, again, the project sponsors on the Living Shorelines projects in terms of what their any sort of initial I'll say tweaks that they made to the design. Again, the Mass Landing project was great because it's been constructed and it's been around for quite some time. So we were able to basically work with Josh and the other folks at PDE to kind of get an understanding of what percentage of their subsequent costs were really adaptive management versus what's more of a long-term recurring sort of maintenance cost.
Okay, great. And maybe when we get to talking about the specific projects with the panel, you guys can talk a little bit more about what went into your adaptive management costs. So for John, there was also some questions about the relationship between the wave action and energy at the site and the costs. So one question was, is the energy at the site directly correlated to the cost of the project?
So, so there is a correlation between the energy and the cost. So the higher the wave energy at the site, the generally the more effort or the more robust the technique needs to be to reduce that energy to some acceptable threshold. So generally the answer is yes. Now that being said, there's also a range of ways to construct projects. So I think that the Gandy's Beach project is interesting because the oyster castle structures themselves are relatively low cost, inexpensive projects built with volunteer labor. I think the picture you see here on the screen now, if it's still up, I think that's us helping construct that project. So that's an example of a structure that's more of a low cost structure that is in a fairly high energy environment. So yes, cost is related to energy, but there are other factors, materials, there's everything from access to the site. So how easy is it to build the site? Can you get there? Can you get construction equipment there? Are you building with volunteer labor? So they're even within, I guess, different energy levels, there's a range of costs. So there are cheaper and more expensive ways to do things.
Thanks. And then specifically for where you compared the Living Shoreline site compared to a traditional gray infrastructure, what was the difference or the similarity in wave action for those? Were they similar or different?
So so the answer is they were somewhat similar. So the Gardner's Basin one was exactly similar because it was within that same enclosed basin, just on the opposite side of the basin. So the exposure was exactly the same. So the Gardner's Basin is truly one-to-one. The Gandy's Beach one is, I would say, similar. Would be pretty much also a one-to-one, and I forget, Strathmere. So the wave energy for all three would be pretty much one-to-one comparison between the gray infrastructure and the living shorelines. Now, for example, in a couple of those locations actually all of those locations where the bulkheads were used, that was driven by requirements from typically navigation. So one was within Gardner's Basin where you needed boats to basically be able to pull up next to the bulkhead. Gandy's Island was near, I believe, Money Island Marina, so there was also more of a boating aspect to that. So the decisions there to go bulkhead were not, it wasn't that wasn't a shoreline stabilization as much as it was also a navigation aspect.
All right, and final question. Do you think that some of the cost differences, in other words, specifically the lower cost a lot of times for a living shoreline, is related to who is implementing the project? So in other words, nonprofits often implemented the living shoreline where a governmental entity might have implemented a gray infrastructure. Do you think that has something to do with the cost difference?
So yes. I would say I would definitely say yes, with the sort of caveat or exception that some of the Living Shorelines projects being sponsored by larger sort of federal grants can also be pretty big and larger in size and more expensive. There's a whole range from sort of an individual homeowner sort of scale of Living Shoreline project up to the Gandy's Beach project was a fairly significant sized project. So definitely that plays a part. But then again, also, there's the exposure plays a big role in that as well. So Matt's Landing is another. I mean, the core rolls work well there, but it's a low energy site. The core rolls would not have worked at all if it was on the sort of the Delaware Bay shore, or if they were used at Berkeley Island, they wouldn't have worked well at all. We kind of see that at Strathmere, where they didn't work all that well.
Okay, great. So before we move into the larger panel, we have a quick poll for everybody. The Nature Conservancy is planning on developing some outreach materials around this report. And so we want to get some feedback on what you find most relevant or important from what you heard today. So if you can go ahead and answer the poll, we'll just give a couple seconds for that. So it looks like from our early results the cost comparison between the living shorelines and the conventional gray was of the most interest, followed by the effectiveness of the living shoreline to work for shoreline stabilization. So that's great to know. All right, so with that, we will move into our panel discussion. I will ask John if you could please stop sharing.
Again.
Perfect. And so for our panel today, we have two of the people who worked on some of these actual projects. We have Josh Moody from Partnership for the Delaware Estuary and Adriana Zito Livingston from the Nature Conservancy. And so to start, I'm just going to ask them to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about the project that they worked on and what their project's primary goals were. And why don't we start with Josh?
Okay, thanks, Vanessa. I'm Josh Moody. I'm the Restoration Programs Manager at the Partnership for the Delaware Estuary. The Matt's Landing project is a project that it was, quote unquote, our project in this. We implemented that with Rutgers University Haskin Shellfish Lab in 2010. But we actually worked on, we were doing some of the project monitoring for the Gandy's Beach, and we also developed the monitoring plans for both Strathmere and Gardner's Basin. So I'm familiar with all four of those sites. Our primary goals in most of the living shoreline work that we do is, enhancing ecological application. So we're primarily interested in developing the ecology, providing ecological uplift, and we rely heavily on a very detailed project monitoring on a variety of different appropriate metrics to get at whatever the information is that's directly related to each project's individual goal to see how they're developing over time. For the Matt's Landing living shoreline, that project had two goals. One of them was shoreline stabilization, and the second was a general ecological uplift. This was put in place in 2010, and it wasn't really still is a research project. There's a lot of learning still going on with living shorelines, and so how to develop the appropriate ecology and the appropriate conditions for it to persist is really, that's our garden to sort of ask and try to answer a lot of those questions.
Great, thanks, Josh. Adriana?
Sure. I should have gone before Josh. He knows all the projects. And so my name is Adriana Zito Livingston. I work for the Nature Conservancy as the Coastal Projects Coordinator. I'm representing and inherited the Gandy's Beach Living Shoreline Breakwater Project. That project was implemented by my colleague Moses Kikowski, and my primary responsibility at that point was field support and volunteer coordination. So as John mentioned, that thing was really challenging to build with a great number of volunteers. And I'm currently serving as the project manager. So I saw some questions in the chat on how the project was funded. And so this was a NIFWEF Sandy Recovery grant issued to Fish and Wildlife Service. And then a subcontracted partnership with the Nature Conservancy. So we're implementing the project early on, and then continuing monitoring for 7 years post-project, which we are 2/3 of the way through at this point. The project is a hybrid living shoreline, so it included features, as John was describing, the Oyster Castle breakwaters. So there's actually 27 breakwaters in 4 different sections along the length of the project, which is about 3,000 linear feet. And it also incorporated shell bags, so use of shell bags in various configurations to help stabilize the upper beach and the shoreline edge. And there's a section of oyster reefs that are actually constructed of shell bags as well. So the project was a hybrid living shoreline. As John mentioned, it's a very dynamic site. As Josh mentioned, we had both engineering goals, so an engineering goal to stabilize the shoreline and reduce the rate of erosion. This is a very highly erosive shoreline. They lose about 6 to 10 feet a year, and that is pretty daunting to design a project. And also provide oyster habitat. So there's both an ecological goal and an engineering goal. And so the challenge, one of the many challenges of this project is finding that sweet spot where you're providing some edge stabilization or shoreline stabilization, and then also providing a place where oysters can actually live. And so I'm excited to share more about that project.
All right, excellent. So to kick us off, I have a general question for each of you. We definitely have seen living shorelines gain traction recently, but I think we all know that still gray infrastructure tends to be the go-to in most cases. This was not true in your case. So I'd love to hear how you ended up choosing a living shoreline for the purpose rather than a traditional method. And why don't we let Josh go first again?
Okay, well, I know Dave Bushik's on here from the Haskin Shellfish Lab, and he could probably speak to this better than me, as he was one of the project leads in 2008, along with PDE science director Danielle Krieger, when they started to develop the Delaware Estuary Living Shoreline Initiative. And really the goal of that was to focus living shorelines a little bit more on the living, what's living, the ecology. There at that point in time, there's traditional infrastructure, but a lot of like the living shoreline techniques in other regions had become, a little bit cookie cutter. There's a lot of planted sills going on, being replicated in a lot of places that may have different ecological needs. And really the foundation of this program was really a research program. Is there a way that we can focus more on site-specific ecological uplift? At these sites, what does it take to install and to install materials that will lead to the appropriate conditions for life to flourish at them? And one of the real focuses of this, we partner with the Haskin Shellfish Lab, Danielle Krieger, myself, a variety of us at PDE are, have backgrounds in shellfish physiology and biology and ecology, was really to look at the relationship between rib mussels and spartinal alterniflora as not only a stabilizing mechanism, but also a potential mechanism for water quality uplift, sort of doubling down on these goals. So this Spartina rib mussel relationship is really one of the primary focuses of the life. And we wanted to start to investigate, what does it take to really exploit that relationship to a degree that not only can you enhance the ecological uplift provided by that relationship, but also serve that benefit of stabilizing shorelines. And we tried a lot, we started that in 2007, 2008, and this one went in 2010. There was one in 2009 that's still going, that's out there. But it took a while to start to figure out how to design that. So we didn't really have a method in place that we just went to for this one. This was the process of a couple of years of trial and error, primarily focusing on, again, marsh grass and rib mussels to provide that fortification, along the edge. So that ecological uplift was really what we wanted to focus on and try to test an usable, replicable application of that.
So I think we should probably call out, and maybe Josh already did this, we are the usual suspects. So these projects were implemented by conservation organizations and research entities, these pilot projects. And because we wanted to learn, we knew there was a lot of foundational information that needed to be addressed and feasibility that needed to be proved. So some social proof of concept, I think, was a unspoken, but very intentional aspect of these early projects. And these projects were characterized in this study because they had been implemented early and their effectiveness could be examined. So costs were a little bit hard to pull out after the fact, and I know that we did our best to do that. But if I can implore anyone on the call, if you're doing a living shoreline project, take those categories and track your costs, because there'll be certainly ongoing information that can be shared over time. So at Gandy's, it was implemented on a nature conservancy preserve, and there was interest and import not only within the region, but the Atlantic coast as a whole, to look at living shorelines and their performance in higher energy systems. And so we felt the pull of hybrid living shorelines and wanting to make them as green as possible. And so that's really what Gandy's was undertaken to do. There was amazing wildlife habitat that was worth preserving. So that was the main, that's the shoreline stabilization goal, was in helping that habitat to persist as long as possible and continue to perform high ecological function for the species that depend on it, including horseshoe crabs and shorebirds. And then also to provide oyster habitat. So to utilize those ecosystem engineers and be able to show feasibility that this project could be built. And then if it look at its performance as a hybrid living shoreline structure, knowing that we had higher wave energy there, as John is indicating, that it's a higher energy site. And what we're learning is it's higher energy from multiple directions than we had originally realized. And so I think that's where the adaptive management really has come in. But it's been a great learning experience and opportunity to use it as a platform to be able to share with folks and inform on future projects. And I think that's one of its highest values, in addition to the habitat that's providing, helping to persist. That's great.
Thanks. So we do have a specific question for Adriana about Gandy's. When you said shell bag, do you mean traditional clam netting made of plastic, or did you use biodegradable shell bags?
So we did, this was a project that was built in 2015, 2016. And the standard technique at the time was to use the plastic mesh shell bags. They've done some with clam and some with oyster shell. And so they were used based on availability. We didn't specifically call for one or the other. So a lot of it was recycled oyster shell and some was clam, but in the mesh bags, and then forming linear reefs, low profile linear reefs in the intertidal. Kind of like speed bumps more than breakwaters. But I can follow up and show images if that's helpful.
Okay, great. Someone had a question about the permitting for these projects. We know now that in New Jersey, the DEP has a general permit for living shorelines. The Army Corps of Engineers now recently has a nationwide permit for living shorelines. I'm not sure that either of these things were in effect yet when you all did yours. So can you speak a little bit to the degree of complication in obtaining the permits you needed?
So for Gandy's Beach, it was an individual permit because of scale and the innovative nature of the project, not to mention its positioning in the intertidal. So that project, thankfully, that was all done by the time I stepped into the driver's seat. I'm very grateful to Moses Kowski and our Fish and Wildlife Service partners for handling that part. But there were some growing pains. It was an innovative project, and through the individual permitting process, it got done, and folks were very cooperative and supportive, but it did take a while.
Yeah, I mean, I would second that. In 2007 and 2008, when we were applying for state and federal permits to do a lot of this different living shoreline research in the mouth of the Morris River, there weren't streamlined permitting pathways, and it ate up the budget like crazy. I mean, it ate more than 50% of our original starting budget. There had to be a lot of reworking, and it was because there was just not a pathway towards this kind of work that was set and was clear with all the different agencies that would have an interest in this type of project. So, I mean, from my experience, I think we've come a long way, and things are very streamlined nowadays. And that's one of the hard part about, these cost analyses of some of these types of projects, especially older projects, if they're, implemented And if they're developed under different regulatory pathways, different material cost pathways, which might be due to different material availabilities, a lot of these costs are changing over time and are going to have an effect. The longer a project stays on, they might get smoothed out in the long term. But I would say not having some of those traditional permitting pathways was a huge increase into the original. It was a real drain on the original budget of this project because it was hard to estimate. There was nothing to base that off of what we would need. And it turned out that we needed a lot greater than what we had available.
I think that's a great segue into some other questions that we've gotten in the chat about changing costs over time. Like you said, it's a moving target as the thing evolves. And specifically, some people have asked about monitoring costs and requirements. First, if monitoring was required for these projects, and building off that, there usually is more significant monitoring requirements in many cases for living shorelines than there is for traditional gray infrastructure, which is kind of a strange thing given the impacts, potential impacts of each. So can you speak a little bit to what sort of monitoring you did, whether it was required or not, and any thoughts you have on the difference in monitoring requirements between the different techniques?
So I'm overseeing the monitoring program at Gandy's, which was, as I mentioned, funded through NIFWIF and Fish and Wildlife Service. And so that's a really robust monitoring program that primarily is driven by the funder. So the requirements that came down were from the funder, and then driven, I think, in part too by the areas we wanted to be able to demonstrate success in. So the ecological uplift towards some specific species. So looking at oysters in particular, and then the physical parameters of oysters and nectins, so things that would swim around these three-dimensional reef structures. So we're hoping to create in-water habitat, and we're successful in that. And then also the physical parameters on the site. So looking at, are these structures holding together, and how well they're performing, and then how that's augmenting the shoreline. So looking at vertical and vegetation extent, vertical and lateral position of the shoreline and the topographies, and then over time also looking at how the position of the structures themselves change, so settlement and any movement or distribution like that. So those are all, I think, for the most part, those reports, those success criteria have been shared with our permitting entities, and so they've been willing to accept the monitoring that was required from the funder and learn from that, and not really adding too much on top of that. At Gandy's, there was a horseshoe crab concern, that horseshoe crab impingement, so getting stuck in these structures and being stuck there and having that have a negative impact on the population was a concern. And so we did add responsibly, and with Fish and Wildlife Service too, to make sure that we're looking at these structures, making sure horseshoe crabs aren't getting stuck, which they aren't, which is really good news. But I would say, from a monitoring perspective, it was primarily driven by the funder. And I'm not as familiar with projects more at the community level where monitoring would be required and then be a financial burden, but it's something that should be pursued with intention and with awareness that we don't want to make these projects so expensive that people aren't doing them. We don't want it to be a deterrent.
So for us, I don't recall what our monitoring requirements were, but I mean, that's how we have it. Monitoring was exactly what we wanted to do. For all of our living shorelines, they're research projects. I mean, we come at them pretty heavy with monitoring. That's the reason that we want to implement them most of the time. So all of our living shoreline projects pretty much follow a very similar monitoring plan. A few things we do at all of them. We typically use an RTK, but there's different methods. But we look at the lateral and the vertical position. Are we maintaining an edge? Are we maintaining an appropriate vertical position at different places across it so that the target vegetation is able to persist? We look at the faunal community activity there. And then depending on the project, if we have a water quality goal, we may look at a little more carefully at the development of shellfish biomass. So we're able to, calculate filtration uplift on projects like that. So, all of our projects are monitored heavily, and I should mention that methodologies on those monitoring plans are available in both the Delaware and the New Jersey living shoreline monitoring frameworks that a lot of people in this meeting today were instrumental in helping to develop. I'll try to put links for both of them up in the chat, but really for us, when there's a project being designed, it's going to have a specific goal. And goal-based monitoring is what you want to do. It's a living shoreline, so you're always going to look at some lateral positions of your defined shoreline. But there could be other things like habitat quality, water quality, uplift. And so depending on why you're installing it there, you really want the things that you're measuring to be directly related to the goal and the outcomes you want to see. And then you can choose appropriate methods to get at each one of those metrics. And both of those monitoring frameworks that I mentioned actually walk the user through goals, relevant metrics, and appropriate method selection. So we'll put those up. But yeah, monitoring is always, again, that's how we have our fun. So that's something that we always try to do. And if people are developing living shoreline projects, those two documents I think are pretty useful in helping to guide the user to really assess their trajectories over time, and if their project at any given point in time is being successful. Because a lot of times your project's not going to meet its goal for a minute. It could take a couple of years to develop the ecology to a point where you're starting to hit your targets. But understanding those temporal, that developmental phase is important, and it shouldn't be disheartening to people. So that's why it's really important to set those goals out, understand what the ecologies are trying to build, what the temporal frame is regarding expectations for that, and then and then specifically watch those metrics to see how you're developing over time.
And I just can contribute, in terms of the monitoring, some of those interesting results that were obtained looking at the wave attenuation. It's really important for us, as engineers, to try to understand what the cause of that is, right? Is it the fact that the structures, the elevation of the structures is not high enough? Is it the fact that the spacing of the structures is not is too wide? Is it the fact that the orientation of the structures is perhaps inappropriate for the wave climate? So if we get a better handle on that, which we can only do through monitoring, that's going to help us, improve our ability to design these structures, especially to expand them into a range of conditions, higher energy sites, such as Ganges. Much less important for lower energy sites, but certainly for higher energy sites, the monitoring is key.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think there also have been questions about, that design phase and what you accounted for in the design phase, specifically if there was any modeling for storms or sea level rise. I know for these projects, I don't think storm protection was necessarily one of the goals, but did you take sea level rise into account when you designed elevations and things like that?
I don't at Ganges believe that it was a specific goal. I mean, we're dealing with an onshore erosion. I mean, thankfully the habitat there is nice and wide, so we have time. And what we wanted to be able to do is slow the rate of erosion so that those habitats could naturally succeed and be more resilient over time as things kind of naturally roll back. And as the reefs become more subtidal than intertidal, that's only going to improve for oyster habitat over time. So I wouldn't say it was a specific consideration, but we always try to take sea level rise into account, at least in our awareness on monitoring and what we hope to see in the project. But I don't believe sea level rise modeling. Wind direction and wave direction, storm projection, I believe, but kind of I mean, you want to design your project well and put in the appropriate amount of resources to make sure that your project is designed to meet your goal. But that can be a really expensive and difficult to find portion of your living shoreline project. Not that it's not worth doing, but I think that's an eyes wide open kind of reality. And as we build and innovate and get to the point where we know more about, and we know a lot about how these projects perform over time because of these early projects, and harness that now in engineering, right, John?
Yeah, I mean, it's that Adriana hit it on the head. I think there's certainly an ability to do the appropriate level and scale of modeling that you need to really understand the system to potentially improve the designs. But the reality is that the level of the funding for the projects is oftentimes doesn't allow for that. I mean, I'm aware of certain living shorelines projects where there's been physical model studies and numerical model studies, and these are $3 to $5 million living shorelines projects, right? How many of you have worked on a $5 million living shorelines project, right? Probably not many, right? So $50,000 is probably more more relevant. So you're talking orders of magnitude. So that's something that we need to continue to figure out how to do better, is to how to be able to design the projects, I think, in as informed a manner as possible, using or understanding that the information might be limited at times, and we won't be able to do everything that we would like to do. And I think you can design them to be effective. It's just, it takes a little bit of creativity, and it takes, it takes some time and effort put in on the design phase. And that's, I think, some of what we do with our engineering guidelines, is to try to kind of at least nudge in that appropriate direction.
Also, to add to that, I mean, this is why it's so important to have ecologists and engineers working together on the projects, because the ability of your engineered project to keep pace with rising sea levels is not only going to be dependent on the configuration of the materials, it's also going to be dependent on the available sediment you have out there, the density of the vegetation you're going to be able to maintain, the ecological and biological feedbacks that are going to affect the life, the trapping capacity, and all of that on the living shoreline. So, these are very complex and very site-specific processes a lot of times. So, it's important to remember during the design phase that, if biological growth and development is going to be one of the drivers that's going to allow a project to keep pace, you don't want to overshoot the biology right away. You don't want to position your living shoreline at a place where, okay, it should be good for 50 years, because you want, at that point, the biology, the vegetation might be a little too high. It might not grow and develop in a way that's going to actually be more natural for it to develop, in dense clusters, to increase its trapping capacity. So really setting those stepwise targets to really meet the ecological needs of the living component of the living shoreline, to help guide you along that trajectory for whatever your time frame of interest is also pretty important. And that's, this de-siloing now of project teams is, what is necessary. It's a very good thing that it's starting to happen, as you can see, by the diverse group of people that are here listening to this today.
I think that's one of the most solid wins that I see and am excited by with living shorelines and how they've developed in New Jersey, is that, regularly now, like I'm learning and I've learned the engineering speak, and now I can even run a monitoring program related to it. So it's, I used to say, I'm just an ecologist, but no, I mean, you really need to have an understanding of both types, and we're seeing more learning opportunities, trainings, and synergies around that. I think that's really exciting. A lot of power in that.
Thanks, everybody. So we're pretty much at time, but I think that's a great ending point. I know we didn't get to everyone's questions or comments in the chat, but we will try to go through them after the webinar and get back to anyone who still had outstanding specific questions. So with that, we're going to wrap up. We do have one more poll. We're planning on doing future webinars on this topic, and we would like to cater them to what you are interested in. So while I launch this other poll, I'm going to let Adriana take us home.
I really appreciate everybody's time. Obviously, this has been a hot topic, and we're just whetting your appetite for it. Hopefully the final report and being able to share that is a great next step. And this is really, I think, just the beginning of hopefully being able to serve more interesting topics up to you, so we can continue to have these discussions, make these connections in these forums, even if it's just virtually for now. So we really appreciate you guys weighing in on these future topics, all of that are on our list of things we'd like to produce for you. We'll also, I think, let some of the themes in the chat inform how we plan future webinars and how. So thank you so much for spending part of your pre-holiday week with us and learning about this topic. I really appreciate the hard work of Stevens Institute, so Laura Kerr and John Miller in their lab. They've been instrumental in preparing this, and thank you, Josh Moody, for being my fellow panelist and one of my favorite project people overall, in addition to all of our partners that were here on the call and providing supporting information when I couldn't keep up in that. So thank you so much. Look for more coming soon. And I appreciate Vanessa for her mad facilitation skills. This has been a lot of fun, and hopefully we're learning a lot. Thank you guys. Have a great day.